Our first one is from Matthew, and he just listened to episode 97, and in that episode, Mike mentions that seraphim indicate an Egyptian context, and the cherubim a Babylonian context. In light of the above, do the cherubim in the tabernacle and temple represent a Babylonian context for this cult elements and not the genuine Egyptian context of the Exodus?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. Probably something that I could have clarified a little bit whenever that was, episode 97, whenever that happened. But the short answer is no, not necessarily. The issue here is the origin of the term Keruv, cherubim, all that sort of thing. Now, Akkadian, again, this is a term that, as far as anybody in the field can discern, based on comparative parallels, the language. The term comes from Akkadian, and Akkadian was known in ancient Egypt in what would have been the Mosaic era. Akkadian was kind of like English is today. It was the language of international correspondence. So Egyptians are going to naturally be exposed to it. Moses, again, giving the biblical description of his context, would have had a pretty good education. So this is something that wouldn't have been new to him, wouldn't have been something that he couldn't have known, wouldn't have been inaccessible to him. So it's conceivable, again, that the writer of the tabernacle, temple text, Moses, whoever, and then of course later on when you get into temple material, they certainly could have used the term. It would have been part of their vocabulary. So the issue isn't something like, a writer can only be using this vocabulary if he's like living in or around Babylonians or Mesopotamians or Akkadians or whatever. The issue is this word in their vocabulary? Well, it obviously is because they use it. But what is the history of the word? In other words, we know that it is in their vocabulary, but where does it come from? And in this case, it comes from, Akkadian. So that's probably the question is good because it calls for a little more clarification of that. So whoever wrote this material, Akkadian, had become this term had become part of the Hebrew vocabulary at the time. Now, I should also mention in regard to this, again, if you're following what I just said, that doesn't require the events of the Exodus or the setting of the tabernacle or the setting of the temple to be a Babylonian one. In other words, it doesn't rule out the historical contacts and the contexts of these events that the Bible is describing. Again, the discussion is just about the term. Where does the term come from? Some scholars would, you'll find this particularly in older scholarship. You won't find it so much now, but some will take a look at the ark and the cherubim, the cherubim on the ark, and they'll compare that to Egyptian palanquins. And you say, well, what's a palanquin? It's a good Scrabble word here, Mike. Palanquin. A palanquin is a box. Okay. Again, this is a podcast. It's an audio thing, so it doesn't really translate well to what we're doing here. But if you just Google palanquin, Palanquin, you're going to find examples, and a lot of them look like the ark, again, except for the lid, the cherubim on top of the lid, but it's a box. And inside the box, you could have idols and statues and whatnot. They were either dragged around or carried around, on carts or wagons or by people, in different ceremonies in Egypt. And because of the Exodus story, has this Egyptian context, a lot of people have thought of, one of these palanquins was probably the template for the ark. Well, there's a bit of guesswork in there, maybe in terms of design, architecturally, if I can use that term here, that might have some validity. But that doesn't mean, for instance, that some palanquins who have the images of Isis and Nephthys on them, they're both winged goddesses, that's where Moses is getting the inspiration for the cherubim. Isis and Nephthys were not throne guardians. Okay, they're not creaturely. The cherubim are not described as feminine, for instance. And in fact, the term, again, is an Akkadian one. It's not an Egyptian one. So you can't press the point of comparison too much. But in terms of the visual, a box, well, okay, maybe this is what they were thinking of, or Moses had seen one of these before, or something like it. You get the box idea. Maybe you can draw some parallels though, but not the term. The other thing is too, you can't press a lot of this too far, because if you extend this to the tabernacle, where you have a tent dwelling, well, that's very Semitic. This idea of the deity, sort of living in a tented structure. Again, thinking of the sort of a patriarchal analogy, Yahweh being sort of the patriarch or the divine council sort of thing. Well, again, you get that flavoring. So what you actually see in the Hebrew Bible is kind of a mixture. You have, again, cultural points of contact, Egyptian, maybe the palanquins or the tented structure, the tabernacle. And then you have linguistic points of contact. Here you have an Akkadian term that winds up, being the term of choice, for this particular feature, of the Ark of the Covenant. So there's all sorts of cultural and linguistic contacts, points of contact going on here. You never just have one particular context, especially if this is your setting, this part of Israel's history. So this was a good question, again, just to talk about some of these other things. So don't be misled into thinking that there's this one point of contact here, and then the narrative or the story has to be read against that one point of contact. And especially if it's language related, we don't know when Charuv would have entered the Hebrew language, the Hebrew lexicon, as it were. We just know that it did, and we know where the term comes from.